Well, good morning. Thanks, Heidi, for the introduction. I am so excited to talk to you about conflict. And I realize I might be the only person who would ever say that. But I hope that at the end of this, you might be a little bit more on the side of team healthy and productive conflict. So my name is Noelle Notermann. Quick background about me. I started out my career in classical music and foreign languages. Then I spent time as a teacher, and then community and student development. And that's where I really started learning about conflict coaching, and as a facilitative mediator. And then I made a transition into tech. I am a proud boot camp grad. And yes, thank you. Yes, indeed. And I have been a full stack engineer and a DevOps engineer, and now am a senior engineer. So what I hope to do today is to talk about getting to a core definition of imposter syndrome, which I think has been misunderstood, mislabeled, misused quite a bit, and also how conflict fluency can help. So I'll read this slide here. It says, how is imposter syndrome defined? But the word syndrome is crossed out, and the word phenomenon is there. And if you don't know the history, the original research done around imposter syndrome was in the 1970s by two researchers. They studied what they called high-achieving women. And these were white women in the United States who had completed an MBA degree and were in their post-MBA career climb. So kind of a limited study. It was a small group. And the term that they coined out of this research was imposter phenomenon. Okay? They never used the word syndrome. And it wasn't until later studies and popular culture sort of changed this language. And I believe that words matter. And so the word phenomenon, right, how does that word strike you? It's lighter, it's fascinating. An aspect of a phenomenon is that it's fleeting, it's passing. Now think about the word syndrome and how that strikes you. It's downright terrifying, isn't it? Right? A syndrome feels so heavy, and it impacts multiple major aspects of your life. It's something that you have forever. So I want to point out again, the original research was this term, imposter phenomenon. Okay? And I started to raise some questions for me when I learned that. And let's get to the definition of imposter phenomenon. You'll hear me use both terms throughout. So a couple of the key areas of the actual definition coined in the research is that there is this perception of self where, regardless of accomplishments or achievements or education, the person feels that they have self-doubt. They push harder and harder, but they never make any real progress because they're the ones that are moving the goalpost over and over again. There's an aspect of fear and guilt. Fear of success and fear of failure, so you lose either way. And then if you are successful, there's feelings of guilt about that success. But this third part of the definition, imposter phenomenon, was studied as a reaction to particular events and stimuli. It is considered to be environmental. It is an experience that occurs within a person as a reaction to stimuli. It is not a medical disorder. It is not listed in the DSM or the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. And so what that means in the United States, where this research was done and where we are, is that if you feel like you have imposter syndrome and you are negatively impacted by it, you cannot receive reasonable accommodations under the ADA for that. You cannot access health care through your insurance. You cannot access therapies or medications or things like that. And that component of it also started to make me more curious, right? What's going on with this imposter phenomenon? Something that I've heard I could have, it's going to be terrible, and yet I can't get any help for it. But in fact, there is some help for it. You can pay money out of your own pocket. You can buy a self-help book or several. You can pay money out of your own pocket, and you can attend a day-long workshop or two. Or you can watch 1,000 YouTube videos with affiliate links. Now, I'm not knocking the work of people who are doing that. Please understand that. But when I see commoditization and commercialization of my feelings, I start to question that, right? I start to question that from its very core. The other thing about this environmental aspect is that it is localized to one area of life, usually. So that means when I'm in the grocery store, I can pick out an avocado with confidence. I know the tomato I want, and I feel good. But then I go to work, and I feel like a fraud. So why is that? Why is that? So again, the idea is that maybe it's not you, maybe it's me, maybe it's something else that's going on. Maybe there are systems and structures in place that are sort of contributing to this, and that's what I want to talk about. Let's get back to words again. We talked about phenomenon versus syndrome. This word imposter, right? This also, I take some issue with this. The problem with being an imposter is that it implies that there's a singular way to be an engineer, right? You're pretending to be someone else. If I'm pretending to be an engineer or the perfect engineer, I'm trying to look, think, act like that person. But there is no one way of being. And I look like an engineer. I wear my button that says, I look like an engineer. I love that campaign, right? We look like engineers. And then the other thing that I did for myself is I said, what is this ideal engineer that I have in mind? And so I explored that. And for me, my experience, that person was male, middle-aged, white, cisgendered, bearded, glasses, rode a bike everywhere. That was my ideal engineer. And if you fit that identity, I am not knocking you. It happens to be my older brother who's an engineer. But that was my ideal. And so right away then, if that's my picture, then I am always going to be an imposter because I don't have those identities. Or if you don't want to do it representationally, and I understand that. My other image was that an ideal engineer always had the right answer right away. Here I was on Stack Overflow, drowning in terrible answers. But that ideal engineer knew it right away. And that's not realistic either. And so a big part for me was realizing that that image of the ideal engineer, guess what? It needs to be you. It needs to be a future you. It can only be a future you. You with more skills. You learning that thing you wanted to learn. You with that certification you wanted. But it must be a future you. And if you do this, and that person in your mind is not you, I encourage you to revisit that and make sure. Otherwise, you're destined to always feel like an imposter. So if I've sparked some curiosity already, and I hope you have, I want to mention that a lot of what I talk about also touches in the intersection of imposter syndrome and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEIB, adding belonging. And there are really talented, wonderful scholars in this area. That is not my area of expertise. But I want to point out Ruchika Tulshyan and Jodi Ann Bury. They both had books that came out recently. They wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review last year called "Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome." And yeah, thank you. I agree. It's a fantastic article, and they had a follow-up as well. We'll take a little quote from that in the next slide. Or Cyril de Summers-McGee, who has some excellent videos about how to sort of disrupt the status quo. So there's resources at the end of the talk. There's a slide about those, and I would encourage you to read more in that space as well. Let's take a look at a quote from Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome, because this really spoke to me, and it ties into where I want to go next. I'll read it out loud. The impact of systemic racism, classism, xenophobia, and other biases was categorically absent when the concept of imposter syndrome was developed. Many groups were excluded from the study, namely women of color and people of various income levels, genders, and professional backgrounds. Imposter syndrome puts the blame on individuals without accounting for the historical and cultural contexts that are foundational to how it manifests. Imposter syndrome directs our view toward fixing women at work instead of fixing the places where women work. So I don't think that it only has to apply to women, and I'm happy to chat more about that with other people. That's what this article was focused on. It spoke to me, and I think it's really important to take that lens as well. So let's meet my friend LaShawn. We'll play a game here. LaShawn is a bright, upbeat, woman-identifying person. She recently graduated from a boot camp. She's had some professional experience before, and she's proud of that background, but she's really excited to break into tech and to see what her future holds in this industry. During boot camp, she heard about imposter syndrome. There was even a talk given about it, but she didn't feel that it applied to her very much yet. So she's got her first job. She is nervous, but really jazzed. I'm going to share some of her experiences on the job, and I want you to put yourself in LaShawn's shoes. I'll share that these experiences are real experiences. They are shared with permission here. We're going to play Do You Have Imposter Syndrome Yet? Think about if this was you, how you might feel. And you can raise your hand if you're able or verbalize, I have it, if and when you think you might start to identify more and more with imposter syndrome. So reading the onboarding docs, LaShawn sees, we pride ourselves on our welcoming culture. Hey, that sounds great. Okay, do you have it yet? Maybe not. Let's keep going. LaShawn notices that the team has a lot of members with similar backgrounds and even similar appearance. Mostly all white male, parents with similar aged children, similar hairstyles, clothing options, similar hobbies, even live in the same neighborhood. They've known each other a very long time, lots of shared experiences, some even changed jobs together. Well, that's funny, right? LaShawn realizes that the team seems very close, and while she does have some points of commonality with some members of the team, she's also different in key ways. Just moving through her experiences. Here's a quote. You're really smart, much smarter than I thought. This is a peer, not someone that LaShawn has worked very close with yet. I see a couple of hands popping up on this one. Sure, maybe. Then LaShawn is invited to a larger company presentation outside of the team. Her manager was asked to give a talk about the hiring process that LaShawn went through. She learns through this talk that the team did outreach to some specific groups to get the job posting out more broadly, and that the process was changed to be seemingly more inclusive for the applicants. The team and the manager specifically are praised for this new approach, which brought a diverse hire, I'm doing air quotes, a diverse hire onto the team. LaShawn was not invited to speak or to contribute in this presentation at all, though she was called out by name during the presentation as a product of their new and improved hiring process. How are you feeling now? Yeah, lots more pop up on this one, sure. And that's okay, and if it doesn't, that's fine too. It keeps going though. LaShawn wants to get to know the team better and has really only worked with one other person. So she inquires in her one-on-ones about doing something non-work with the team to get to know each other, like a trivia game or something fun. The manager tells her that the team wouldn't like that, but that she can schedule short one-on-ones with each team member individually to get to know them. But they all seem really busy, and she doesn't want to impose. Maybe, yeah, more. So this team has a feedback model that says just assume everything's fine unless you hear something else, right? So no news is good news. All right, I can roll with that, LaShawn thinks. Well, at least for a while, she thinks that. But what do you think happens when there finally is some constructive feedback? And she begins to dread getting any feedback because it will have to be negative feedback. And without any context on what she's doing well, what she should do more of, or what she should do less of, she's working in a void without guidance. And she's starting to feel like she has to overwork and be perhaps perfect just to avoid the negative feedback that will come. So at this point, LaShawn's not feeling so great, and I saw lots of hands go up as we moved along. So just a quick recap. I wanted to get to that core definition, but I also want to reassure you that whatever you feel is absolutely okay and correct for you. I'm not here to tell you that you don't have imposter syndrome, sincerely. You decide for yourself how you feel and how you want to label and address those feelings. My goal is to plant a seed for all of us that it might be possible that imposter syndrome is less within a person, but more because of systems and structures and dynamics of best practices, or this is how we've always done it, that were perhaps not thoughtfully designed in the first place, or not intentionally revisited, right, to adjust for the changes and diversification of those who are now in those systems. In other words, every company says we want a diverse, high-performing team. But what are we doing to look at the environments where those teams are working to make sure that they also are changing as we're changing those who are in them? So what are we going to do about it? And that's where we get to what I really love talking about. So we're going to go a bit deeper and explore how conflict fluency might help to create more inclusive environments, and specifically ones that do not contribute to feelings of imposter syndrome, or hopefully, at least. But we wouldn't go diving without the right tools and training and without practicing and learning, and I want to approach conflict fluency the same way. Let's learn a little bit about it and let's practice it. So I love this image here, and I'll describe it for accessibility purposes. The top panel says, in large letters, "Who wants change?" ? Then we see all these hands raised in the air, right, implying that many, many people want change. And then the similar panel underneath, the question changes, who wants to change? And we don't see any hands visible there. In fact, we see some squiggly lines and arrows that may imply that a lot of those hands came down really quickly. So a lot of us want change to happen, but when it comes to maybe doing it, those hands are harder to find. So here's what conflict fluency is not. It's not conflict management, right? We're not managing, we're not in charge of a conflict. It's kind of delusional to think that we are. It's not conflict resolution, because sometimes you don't actually resolve anything. So those two terms are a little bit older terms in the studies of conflict. Now we talk a little bit more about conflict fluency. It's also not negotiation, where we say, all right, I'll change, but you change first, or I'll change a little bit if you change a little bit, right? We find a space in the middle. That's not the point of conflict fluency. Conflict fluency is a set of skills, something you can learn and practice and develop, and that's that idea of a growth mindset, which we hear so much about. It's also knowing yourself, understanding how we show up in conflict. What's our conflict style? What does that mean for how we navigate conflict? It's building up a conflict tolerance. I think this one is critical. The more we do it, the easier it will get, right? Hopefully, maybe, but we have to try it. We have to get better at it. And then, since becoming an engineer, I've added these last two, words near and dear to all of our hearts, iterative and incremental. And I added those because when we think of conflict, we often think of this giant ball of conflict. It's gnarly and it's knotted and it's ready to be kicked down the road or hidden under a carpet, right? That's what we want to do with conflict. But if that ball of conflict was instead a technical blocker for us, we wouldn't do that. We couldn't do that and stay employed, right? We have skills and tools that we would use to break that apart, to take a small piece, to try something, to document what we've tried. We would bring in other experts and resources. We would swarm on it. There's so much that we would do with that technical blocker, but when it's conflict, we don't tend to do those things. So part of my hope is that we realize that we've built up these skills, we just have to transfer them to this other area. So who should practice this? Who is responsible for this hard work? Very easy answer, all of us. Leaders, managers, even the person who is impacted, although maybe with an asterisk there to not double that person's work. But I do have a special call out for peers and colleagues, for people who consider themselves allies or accomplices, or a term I like is active bystander, someone who's alert and engaged in what's happening and can choose to act. So this is where knowing yourself really matters, because you might be right here, right now, saying, I don't do conflict, right? And maybe that's popular here in Minnesota, I'm not sure. But I'm not gonna do it, right? That's just, it's too much for me. But you can still act, and this is what I want you to walk away with. You can still do something. You can talk to another colleague or a manager about what you're witnessing. Or maybe you are the person that someone comes to, but you know that you're conflict avoidant. You can still act, and you could say something like, I have a really hard time with conflict personally, but I hear you, and I see you, and I want to help. Could we brainstorm together some possible next steps? Or consider talking to someone else together so that you won't be alone in that. So even if you have those feelings and you know that, that's that pre-work, you can still act. Some core areas of conflict fluency. There's a lot of text here, but I'll just call out a few ones. One of the critical aspects of conflict fluency is viewing conflict as a valuable step toward change. You have to see that it has value. If we don't, we won't ever do it. So healthy and productive conflict is a valuable step toward a change. It has value. Also, learning to navigate conflict in a constructive versus destructive way, being intentional and thoughtful in the steps that you take, and also being effective, thinking about it, taking the step, and then reflecting back or measuring how was that impact. So being intentional and effective. As I've already talked about, understanding how you show up in conflict, knowing that your reactions and your feelings are normal, natural, biological. If you're a person who gets the racing heartbeat when conflict comes your way, or you get the sweaty palms or the fluttery breath, natural. Not good, not bad. Just data for your body, for you to know that that's how you're feeling and you're appearing in conflict. But also knowing and maintaining your boundaries, right? Where are your lines? And respecting those as you move through conflict. Core skills of reflection and reframing, and we'll practice those in a bit. Asking questions, asking really hard questions. I once had an HR director say to me, "You have a talent for making people uncomfortable with your questions." I said, "Thank you." Thank you. I don't know that that was the right response, but thank you. Seeking to understand versus seeking to win. Seeking to connect and ideally maintain relationships. Now, my background as a mediator, facilitative mediator, is based on the fact that the two parties want to remain in a relationship. If they don't want to be in a relationship, then mediation might not be the best path, right? So ideally, maintaining a relationship. And then practice. I have a music background. Practice, practice, practice. Practice some more. Do a dress rehearsal. I'll keep saying that. A little call out here for risk assessment. This is a little bit formal, but the fact is, before you take a step, before you enter into a conflict, think about even the core question of, is change even possible here? Is it worth my effort here? You get to decide the answer. What's the risk of not acting? How will you feel? How might others feel? What's the risk of the unwanted or the unhappy path? Can you mitigate that? Can you adjust for that somehow? So being thoughtful ahead of time. Get help and input from other people, especially if they're outside the conflict, some trusted sources. And then do an assessment like this, but always trust your gut, trust your instincts. If you do this and the math says you should act, but it doesn't feel right, trust yourself. So there's sad LaShawn again. Let's see if we can change the story for LaShawn. She's done the risk assessment, she wants to act. And maybe we can make the outcome different for her moving forward. And we're going to revisit some of those experiences earlier on. So when a company says that it is already welcoming, that its culture is done, what does that mean to a new person who doesn't actually feel particularly welcome? This is that idea of intent versus impact. And if you've been in the DEI space, you've heard this before. You think people will feel welcome, but in fact, the impact might be that some groups or individuals feel unwelcome, or maybe even alienated if they're not welcomed in a way that works for them. So if you are a colleague in this environment, you're in this environment, you can use the skills of reflection and reframing to make a change. You can hold the company accountable to this statement in your onboarding documents. So reflect back. I know that we feel like nice people, and I did pick nice on purpose. We are kind and welcoming. And then reframe it. But how do we know this is actually working? What are we doing to ensure this? This can be a problem if people don't actually feel welcome, but it's also an opportunity for us to do better in this area, right? If it isn't measured, it isn't real. Or if LaShawn came to you with this concern as a manager, you could just ask, what things could we do as a team to help you feel more welcome, LaShawn? I know you mentioned trivia, and I'm sorry that I pushed that activity aside when you mentioned it. Could we bring that to the team to discuss as a group? Or maybe ask them what activity might be good for us to get to know each other. I'm happy to put that on the agenda for the next team meeting, and you can lead the discussion. Or I can if you prefer. What other ideas do you have? So this is a really simple model. Apologize, ask how to make it right, but bring some ideas to the table. Right? Apologize, ask how to make it right, but bring some ideas. Help do some of the work. This one's tougher for me. I'm a bit sassy personality-wise, I admit that. This is where I would ask those questions, really ask those questions, right? You're really smart, much smarter than I thought. And LaShawn could say, well, tell me more. What do you mean? Because what if the response is something like, I didn't pick this stuff up nearly as quickly as you are. I'm really impressed. Ah, okay. Now we can adjust. This was a poorly worded compliment, right? It happens. It happens sometimes. But maybe that's not what's going to happen. Maybe the response is going to reveal a little bit of bias. Maybe the response is, I guess I assumed a boot camp grad wouldn't understand a lot of this. Okay, some educational background bias there, could be. We could hear a different kind of bias. We had an XYZ identity person on the team before, whatever that is, female, BIPOC, et cetera, and they didn't understand anything. Now we're in a different conversation, right? Those are three very different conversations, and that's when you have to adjust and adapt, but I wouldn't know if I didn't ask first. And here's the next step. Get more curious. Ask again. Oh, well, that's interesting. How many people like me have worked on the team before? Why do you think that is? Whatever that number is, right? Is it just one? Is it a whole lot, and the team has a turnover problem that you're learning about in this conversation? That can help guide how you move through this. And maybe then, the person might choose to speak up, or LaShawn might say, well, as someone who identifies as XYZ, I guess I disagree with that, especially since I've had the opportunity to work with many very talented XYZ people in the past. Some personal sharing there, right, connecting. Or LaShawn could use herself as an example to connect without even necessarily addressing. What if she said, since you shared with me that I surprised you in some ways, note that that is a positive reframe, not since you shared with me that you thought I was stupid. Okay, that's a negative reflection, positive. Since you shared with me that I surprised you in some ways, I guess I'll share that I was kind of expecting you to not want to teach me based on some experiences I've had. So I'm really grateful that you're teaching me and that I'm learning. Maybe. I'm not dictating answers here. I'm just trying to show ways that you could move through this space. So I think this diversity hire one would need to be addressed, right? And maybe LaShawn goes to the manager and says, when you gave that presentation about the new hiring practice, I felt like I was publicly labeled as a diversity hire. And then wait, because I would expect you might get, oh no, that's not what I meant at all. Oh no. I hope that would be the response. But that's that intent and impact discussion. And that's where you stay goal-focused. Thank you for sharing that was not the intent. I appreciate that. However, the impact that it had on me was that I worry that others heard that label, and it has a lot of negative connotations associated with it. But then what's the goal? So this is where you have to do that assessment ahead of time. What does LaShawn want? A personal apology? A public apology? Or perhaps working with the manager on the presentation, to be a part of the presentation, to have a voice in it? Maybe. I'm not going to decide what she wants. But having that goal helps you move ahead in that conflict as well. And the manager, has the opportunity again, apologize, ask how to make it right, and bring some ideas. And I would ask you, if you were the colleagues who heard this in a presentation, I hope you would, spark up when you heard something like this. What would you do? What steps could you try to make sure that this gets addressed somehow, right? Call it out. Talk to the manager, talk to LaShawn, listen, don't assume, but take some steps. And so to recap a little bit, imposter syndrome, it's not you, it's them, or the system or the structure, but people are systems and structures. People create and maintain systems and structures, so they don't get to be exempt from them. And get curious about what's going on around you. And that ideal engineer, who is that? Please, if you walk away with one thing, make sure that ideal engineer is a future you. Nobody else, future you. Otherwise, you're destined to fail. Conflict fluency is a skill, not something that you're born with. It takes practice and more practice, and you can learn it. Use those engineering skills that you already have and bring those to the table. And then every single person has a role, and I would say a responsibility, but at least a role in working toward meaningful change. So I can talk about conflict all day, and I am happy to talk at the conference or with anyone else. I love spirited debate and dissenting viewpoints, so bring them to me. Share your stories with me, share your thoughts. It helps us all get better at what we do. So thank you so much. It's great to talk to you today.